Indigo Park is the most recent hit in the mascot horror genre, and for good reason. Not only does it have fun characters and a solid soundtrack, but even with only one chapter out, the story it's setting up seems very interesting. And while we're given a lot of information to start to put this puzzle together, there are definitely still questions raised by the clues we're given. Why does the critter cuff we're equipped with stop some mascots from attacking but not others? Why are said mascots only hostile some of the time? What's the significance of the one character we aren't introduced to with the others, but is instead introduced in a shady and potentially lore-relevant arcade game? Well, sit back and consider subscribing, because today I plan to answer not just these questions, but also explain what really led Indigo Park to the state we see it in today. For those who haven't heard about Indigo Park or need a refresher on the story of Chapter 1, Indigo Park is a sort of Disney-esque amusement park that fell into disrepair after it was suddenly evacuated and closed on October 22nd, 2015. Our player character Ed had gone to Indigo Park as a kid, and having a hobby or job of some sort looking into abandoned locations, he decides to find out what's happened to the place. Upon arriving at the park, he's greeted by Rambley the Raccoon, a friendly AI who, upon realizing it's been 8 years since anyone had been to the park, very enthusiastically equips him with a critter cuff so Ed can get around, and shows off some of the rides associated with the park's 5 mascots: Rambley, Mollie Macaw, Finley the Sea Serpent, Salem the Skunk, though what we see of Salem's portion of the introduction ride is destroyed, and Lloyd the Lion, aka Lloyd. However, it quickly becomes clear that this place was abandoned for a good reason, as throughout the experience, Ed is stalked by a creature that seems to be a living replica of the Mollie Macaw mascot. And while in the park's theater, he encounters another living replica, this time of Lloyd. While Lloyd initially runs from Ed, he ends up stalking him through the backstage, until when he finally attacks, Ed's critter cuff glows and Lloyd recoils and runs. Mollie, on the other hand, keeps her distance until Ed opens the door to the back of the Mollie-themed kids area, which activates an intense chase sequence where if Ed is caught, the critter cuff won't repel Mollie before she gets the kill. Fortunately, Ed is able to get away from her by meeting back up with Rambley, who is initially taken aback by Ed beelining it into a staff-only area, but realizing that Ed is being chased, Rambley on the spot hires him as an employee and slams the door down on Mollie. I will not be showing that scene in its entirety because there was a lot of blood that I am not comfortable showing, but the important thing is that Mollie is dead unless she can somehow regenerate her entire body from just her head. Anyway, Rambley explains that he hadn't realized just how bad things had gotten at the park and asks for Ed's help in fixing up the place. When Ed does not seem visually opposed, Rambley is excited, and the end of the chapter has Ed enter the Oceanic Odyssey ride where we see another mascot, Finley, swimming in a nearby tank, teasing what we have in store for Chapter 2. However, while that does summarize the main events of Chapter 1, and it seems pretty obvious that the murderous mascots had something to do with the park's closure, that's not all the story that's there. With collectibles that give lore clues, an optional arcade game with hidden secrets, and certain things about the mascot's behavior, I think there's a bit more going on than just a bunch of dangerous mascots gone rogue. In fact, I don't necessarily think the mascots want to hurt anyone in the first place. After all, if they really were just mindlessly violent monsters, what was stopping Mollie from attacking the player at pretty much any point where she makes an appearance in the game before her chase? Why is the first thing Lloyd does when you approach his stage is to run away? While one could argue they just wanted to make sure Rambley couldn't help, as he can't see Ed when he goes backstage or in Mollie's play area, you would think that if that were the case, they would start their attacks right away once Ed was in there. Instead, Lloyd waits until the player begins navigating the maze farther in, and while Mollie gets pretty dang close in the play area, she doesn't try to attack Ed until he heads past the door in the back of her area. In fact, it almost seems as though their first instinct is to either observe or flee. They provide an opportunity for Ed to leave, only attacking when he trespasses too far into their territory. As such, while they have definitely hurt people, as shown by the blood on them, the true reason for their aggression is more likely to be fear. Fear of what, you ask? Well, from what we see and hear in the game, we have pretty good evidence that the mascots weren't exactly treated the best by the staff and the customers. In addition to one of the lore collectibles revealing a conversation between 2 employees worrying about the mascots taking their jobs, which wouldn't exactly endear the mascots to the employees, the main evidence we have for this comes from some of the voice lines from Mollie Macaw. From the desk screen we get if she catches the player, we find out that Mollie, with Macaw's being a kind of parrot, has the ability to replicate things she's heard. And while some of her lines are just things she would have overheard while we were wandering around the park, others seem to have come from when the park was still open. And the picture they paint of Mollie's treatment isn't exactly pretty. As a bit of a highlight reel, the lines that stand out to me specifically include,
"Don't touch that thing, son. Get up, you stupid freak. Get back in your cage, bird."
In fact, we even have the chance to see a representation of said cage in the optional arcade game Rambley Rush, where you can find a secret area showing Mollie trapped in a cage. Since this mistreatment likely wasn't unique to Mollie, it's understandable why the mascots aren't particularly happy when Ed pushes too far into their territory. I think it's possible that while they do have a general mistrust of humans, they prefer not to engage unless pursued into an area where they feel as though they should be able to retreat to safely. Whether it's because there were some humans they interacted with that weren't necessarily bad, or because there's some part of them that still cares about people, it seems like they attack primarily as a last resort. But speaking of attacking, I think it's very interesting that the critter cuff apparently has the ability to stop Lloyd from attacking. This feature would have had to be programmed in intentionally, likely to protect the guests or employees who would have critter cuffs on them in order to access the park and get around in the first place, implying that the mascots were showing signs of aggression for some time while the park was still open, and steps were taken to keep them from making a move. So if that's the case, what happened for things to get so bad that the park had to get evacuated? They would have had to find some way to get around the restrictions the critter cuffs placed on them. Well, I think it's possible that this connects back to Indigo Park's 5th mascot character, Salem the Skunk. Since Salem's part of the introductory ride is destroyed, which definitely seems to imply that something about Salem is pretty dang important, our only real introduction to who this character is comes from the Rambley Rush arcade game. At the end of that game, Rambley comes across Mollie, who crashed her plane after Salem set up a smokescreen in her way. Then Salem uses a potion on Mollie that gets rid of her friendship with Rambley, forcing Rambley to defeat Mollie to beat the game. Something I find rather interesting in the context of Mollie not being repelled by the critter cuff like Lloyd is. In fact, I think it's not unlikely that Salem's explanation about how, with Mollie under the influence of the potion, there was nothing stopping her from tearing Rambley to pieces, is connected to why the critter cuff doesn't stop Mollie from tearing Ed to pieces like it does with Lloyd. While I could definitely be reading too far into things, the inclusion of this game, and it being our only real introduction to a major character at all, seems too intentional for me to ignore. I think it's completely possible that the secret of Mollie in the cage isn't the only lore-relevant information we have here. After all, while we don't see a living replica of Salem in Chapter 1, with how we see all the others except for Rambley, I would be pretty surprised if a living version of Salem wasn't around somewhere. Additionally, it does seem as though the mascots have some degree of intelligence, making judgment calls about when to attack or not. This does make sense given these guys were interacting with guests, and even if they weren't exactly treating the mascots well, I doubt the Indigo Park staff would have set completely mindless creatures that couldn't act like the characters at all out there to interact with the guests. That would kind of defeat the point of having them, instead of just humans in costumes after all. With this in mind, based on Rambley Rush, Salem as a character seems to be tricky and inventive, creating potions and setting traps. And if the living version of the character was at all accurate to this in personality, I think it's possible that, just as Salem in the game found a way to get rid of the friendship that was stopping Mollie from tearing Rambley to pieces, the living Salem may have found a way to do the same with the critter cuff's ability to stop the mascots from tearing anyone else to pieces. At least temporarily, based on how Lloyd does get stopped by Ed's critter cuff, even though there is blood visible on his paws to show that he is almost definitely killed before. So while we don't have many details about the specifics of what happened, here's how I think the events leading up to Indigo Park's closure may have gone. Whether it be to have a unique experience for the guests, to avoid having to pay human employees, or for some other purpose, the park's mascots were brought to life through whatever sciencey means they came about. However, the employees weren't too happy about this threat to their jobs, and were probably somewhat unnerved by these uncanny valley creatures that shouldn't exist, and took it out on the mascots. When the mascots tried to defend themselves, a feature was added to the critter cuff bands to shock them when they attempted to attack someone wearing one, and as such, the mistreatment continued. Enter Salem the Skunk. Salem was an antagonistic character, and the humans of the park put themselves on the opposing end of that antagonism through their actions. As a character, Salem was intended to be a bit of a wild card, a bit of a trickster, and as such that manifested through Salem figuring out how to work around the boundaries the critter cuffs forced on them, and unleashed the mascots' fury in the park. Indigo Park was evacuated and it shut down, giving the mascots peace in the sense that no one would come to hurt them anymore, at least until Ed shows up at the beginning of Chapter 1. Of course, I could be completely wrong about all of this, and something in the next chapters could come up that proves me wrong entirely. But hey, it'll be interesting to see where Indigo Park's story goes. I, for one, am looking forward to finding out how Rambley expects his friends to all be united again, like he mentions in the end credits theme, when his best friend is currently missing her head. But with all that said, consider liking the video and subscribing if you enjoyed the theory. Don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.